17 years of quiet endurance ended with the heavy metallic thud of a deadbolt. Rain whipped across the porch, stinging Chloe Hastings' face as she stared at the peeling white paint of the front door. Inside, the muffled, drunken shouting of her stepfather, Rick Gable, slowly faded as he stumbled back toward the living room of their dilapidated single-wide trailer. It was mid-November in Blackwood Valley, a struggling logging town nestled in the shadow of Northern California's towering coastal redwoods. Chloe's mother, Miriam, had passed away from ovarian cancer 8 months prior, leaving Chloe in the custody of a man whose grief manifested strictly in empty whiskey bottles and sudden, violent rage. Tonight, after a dispute over a missing $20 bill, Rick had finally made good on his threats. Chloe stood on the porch with nothing but the clothes on her back, a pair of worn leather boots, and her late grandfather's olive-drab canvas rucksack. Silas Hastings had been a timber cruiser in the 1960s, a man who knew the woods better than he knew himself. Before his death, he had taught Chloe how to strike a fire in the pouring rain, how to read the topography of a hillside, and most importantly, how to disappear. She was cold, terrified, and utterly alone. But as the freezing rain soaked through her denim jacket, a hard, diamond-like knot of resolve formed in her chest. She would not knock on a neighbor's door. She would not become a ward of the state. She turned her back on the trailer park and began to walk toward the imposing, ink-black silhouette of the Blackwood Ridge. The hike was a brutal 3-mile ascent through dense underbrush and slippery, needle-slicked mud. Hypothermia was a creeping, silent predator in these woods, and Chloe's teeth were chattering violently by the time she breached the boundary of the Pacific Timber Reserve. She was looking for a ghost. Years ago, sitting on the porch whittling a piece of cedar, her grandfather Silas had told her a local legend about a tree he called the Devil's Chimney. It was a coastal redwood, Sequoia sempervirens of impossible proportions. Nearly a century ago, a massive lightning strike had ignited its crown. The fire had burned down through the core of the tree, hollowing it out completely, yet the living cambium layer on the outside had survived. The tree continued to grow, leaving a massive cavernous room inside its base. Guided only by moonlight filtering through the storm clouds and her grandfather's old topographical map, Chloe searched the upper ridge. Hours passed. Her hands grew numb. Just as despair threatened to overtake her, the beam of her small flashlight swept across a massive wall of deeply grooved reddish-brown bark. The tree was a titan, easily 20 feet in diameter at its base. On the leeward side, hidden behind a thick curtain of sword ferns, was a vertical fissure. Chloe squeezed through the opening. Inside, it was pitch black, perfectly dry, and smelled faintly of ancient charcoal. The hollow was staggering nearly 14 feet across, stretching up into absolute darkness like the interior of a Gothic cathedral. She collapsed onto the soft, dry earth floor, pulled her grandfather's wool blanket over her trembling shoulders, and slept the deep, dreamless sleep of the exhausted. Survival is rarely a montage of quick successes. It is a grueling, daily grind of calories expended versus calories gained. Over the next 3 weeks, Chloe transformed from a frightened runaway into a feral architect. She realized early on that she needed to insulate the hollow and secure the entrance to keep out the damp cold and any curious black bears. At night, she made dangerous miles-long treks down to the Blackwood Valley Municipal Dump and the abandoned Pacific Timber staging grounds. She became a phantom scavenger. She hauled up discarded corrugated tin roofing, dragging the heavy sheets through the brush for miles. She found a rusted heavy-duty truck suspension spring and unwound the thick wire to create snares for rabbits and squirrels. Her most prized find was a cast-iron wood stove, cracked down one side, discarded behind a rusted-out hunting cabin. Moving the 80-pound stove up the ridge took her 3 agonizing days of leveraging it over logs with thick branches. Inside the tree, Chloe went to work. She built a raised floor using fallen cedar branches, lashing them together with scavenged parachute cord, keeping her sleeping area off the frozen earth. She insulated the interior walls with thick layers of dried sphagnum moss and mud, packing it into the charred grooves of the wood. For the entrance, she constructed a heavy door from salvaged oak pallets, hinging it on thick leather belts she found in a donation bin. She camouflaged the outside of the door with bark and living ferns. When closed, the entrance to the tree vanished entirely into the forest. The masterstroke was the stove. She positioned it in the center of the hollow. The redwood, acting as a natural chimney, drew the smoke upward through its hollow core, venting it nearly 200 feet in the air through a gap in the canopy. From the ground, there was no smoke, no smell. She was invisible. Winter set in with a vengeance in January. The temperature plummeted and heavy snow dusted the high ridges. Chloe survived on a meager diet of snared rabbits, foraged pine nuts, and canned beans she had stolen from an outdoor storage shed in town. She was losing weight. Her hands were permanently calloused, and loneliness began to gnaw at the edges of her sanity. Then came the twist that nearly ended it all. It was a Tuesday morning. Chloe was inside, feeding wet kindling into the stove, when she heard the unmistakable crunch of heavy boots on the frozen pine needles outside. Then a voice. "I know someone's in there. I saw the tracks leading off the logging road. Come out slow, or I'm calling the county sheriff." Chloe's heart stopped. She grabbed her hatchet, her knuckles turning white. Slowly, she pushed the hidden door open. Standing 10 feet away, leveling a 12-gauge shotgun at her, was Thomas Arris. Tom was a 50-year-old private land surveyor for Pacific Timber, a man with a weathered face and cynical eyes. He'd been surveying the ridge for a potential clear-cut operation. He expected to find a dangerous squatter or perhaps a clandestine methamphetamine lab. Instead, he saw a gaunt 17-year-old girl in a mud-stained jacket holding a rusty hatchet with trembling hands. Tom lowered the shotgun. He stared at her, then looked past her into the hollow tree, his eyes widening as he took in the engineered floor, the stove, the meticulously stacked firewood. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered. Chloe didn't speak. She prepared to run. "Who are you?" Tom asked, his voice losing its harsh edge. "Where are your parents?" "Dead," Chloe lied, her voice raspy from disuse. "Please, I'm not hurting the tree. I'm not hurting anything. Please don't send me back." Tom stood in the freezing wind for a long time. He had a daughter, Sarah, who had run away to Portland 5 years ago. He hadn't seen her since. He looked at Chloe, seeing the desperate feral will to survive in her eyes. "I didn't see anything today," Tom finally said, turning around. "But this ridge isn't safe. The company's coming." He didn't report her. In fact, a week later, Chloe found a waterproof duffel bag left at the base of a nearby Douglas fir. Inside was a 50-pound bag of rice, a first aid kit, a box of heavy wool socks, and a battery-powered crank radio. A note taped to the radio read, "Keep your head down." Spring blossomed, and summer faded into a cool autumn. Chloe turned 18 inside the tree. She had carved the life out of the wood, reading old paperbacks by the light of a kerosene lantern, tending to a small garden of wild onions and tubers she had transplanted. The hollow sequoia was no longer just a shelter. It was a living, breathing entity that had cradled her when the human world had thrown her away. But nature is indifferent to human attachment. In late October, the crank radio crackled to life with an emergency broadcast. A massive atmospheric river, caught in the grip of a bomb cyclone, was barreling toward the Northern California coast. The meteorologists were calling it a once-in-a-century event. Winds were projected to exceed 130 miles per hour, accompanied by torrential rains that would inevitably cause catastrophic flooding and mudslides. Down in Blackwood Valley, panic set in. The town, nestled at the bottom of a bowl-shaped valley surrounded by heavily logged, unstable hillsides, was a sitting duck. The storm hit at midnight on October 28th. Inside her cabin, Chloe experienced a terror unlike anything she had ever known. The wind did not howl, it screamed. It sounded like a fleet of freight trains tearing through the canopy. The ancient redwood, 20 feet thick and hundreds of feet tall, began to groan and sway. Chloe huddled in the center of her raised floor, her arms wrapped around her knees. Dust and ancient flakes of charcoal rained down from the dark chimney above. Outside, the terrifying sharp crack of massive trees snapping echoed like artillery fire. Douglas firs and lesser pines were being ripped from the earth, crashing to the forest floor with seismic force. She pressed her hands against the interior wall of her tree. She could feel the vibrations, the sheer tension in the wood fibers as the giant fought the gale. She knew that redwoods survive because their shallow roots intertwine with the trees around them, holding each other up. If her tree went down, she would be crushed instantly. For 14 hours, the storm battered the coast. Chloe stayed in the dark, praying to her mother, to her grandfather, and to the tree itself. "Hold on," she whispered to the wood. "Just hold on." When the roaring finally subsided to a dull, rushing hiss of rain, Chloe pushed her heavy door open. The landscape was unrecognizable. The forest looked as though a giant had stepped on it. Sunlight poured in where a thick canopy had once blocked it out. Massive, splintered trunks lay haphazardly across the ridge, but the devil's chimney, scarred and battered, stood tall. Yet it survived. Chloe grabbed her radio and her hatchet, climbing carefully over the debris. She needed to see the valley. When she reached the overlook, her breath caught in her throat. Blackwood Valley was underwater. The Blackwood River had breached its banks, swallowing the main street. But far worse was the eastern hillside. Decades of aggressive clear-cutting had left the soil unstable. The torrential rain had liquefied the earth, sending a massive, devastating mudslide directly into the lower residential sector. The trailer park where she had lived was gone. It had been entirely swept away, buried under thousands of tons of mud, rocks, and debris. A complex surge of emotions hit her. Rick, her old neighbors, the life she had escaped. Without thinking, Chloe began the treacherous descent toward the disaster zone. The town was in chaos. Emergency services were overwhelmed, blocked by washed-out roads. The surviving residents had gathered near the high school gymnasium, frantically trying to dig out homes that were half buried in the mudslide. Chloe emerged from the tree line like a ghost. Covered in dirt, wearing clothes patched with animal hide and scavenged thread, she looked wild. But she possessed something the panicked townspeople did not: elite, hardened wilderness survival skills and a terrifying calm under pressure. She ran toward a collapsed ranch-style house where a group of men were futilely pulling at a massive roof beam. A family was trapped inside the air pocket of the basement. "You're using the wrong leverage," Chloe shouted over the din of the rain. She pushed past a local mechanic, unspooling the heavy-duty parachute cord from her waist. She quickly tied a timber hitch around the beam, utilizing a nearby standing oak tree to create a makeshift pulley system. "Pull on my mark," she commanded. The men, too shocked to question the feral girl commanding them, obeyed. The beam lifted just enough. Chloe, small and agile, slid under the gap and dragged out two terrified children and their mother one by one. For the next 10 hours, Chloe worked alongside the town's volunteer fire department. She shored up collapsed walls with her hatchet, navigated treacherous mud flows, and applied tourniquets. As night fell, she was helping dig out the remnants of a crushed single-wide trailer. Underneath a crumpled sheet of aluminum, she heard a weak moan. Chloe dug her hands into the freezing mud, clearing it away to reveal a face. It was Rick Gable. His leg was pinned under a rusted steel chassis. He was pale, hypothermic, and bleeding out. He looked up, his unfocused eyes finally landing on Chloe. Recognition slowly dawned, followed by absolute bewilderment. Chloe, he choked out. She stared down at the man who had thrown her away to die in the cold. For a fleeting second, the memory of her mother's tears and her own terrified, freezing nights flashed through her mind. She could walk away. In the chaos, no one would ever know. But Chloe realized something in that moment. The woods had stripped away her weakness, but they had not stripped away her humanity. The giant redwood had sheltered her when it didn't have to. It had absorbed the storm to keep her alive. She would not let the storm inside her win. "Don't talk, Rick," she said flatly. She wedged the solid piece of timber under the chassis, using her body weight and an iron bar to lever it up just enough. "Pull your leg out. Now. Rick dragged himself free, screaming in pain. Medics rushed over to stabilize him. As they loaded him onto a backboard, he reached out, trying to grab Chloe's jacket. "How?" he whispered. "Where did you go?" Chloe looked at him, her eyes cold and ancient as the forest she called home. "I grew roots," she said. The aftermath of the Saint Jude's Gale of the Pacific made national news. When the National Guard finally arrived and the town began to rebuild, stories began to circulate about the mysterious, wild-looking girl who had descended from the ridge and saved a dozen lives, including her estranged stepfather. When a FEMA coordinator finally tracked Chloe down to register her for aid, Tom Eris, the surveyor, was standing beside her. He had driven down as soon as the roads cleared to make sure she was alive. The media wanted a hero. They wanted the sensational story of the teenager who survived a year inside a hollow tree. Reporters tried to hike up the ridge to find the Devil's Chimney, but Tom had purposefully lost his topographical maps, and Chloe refused to lead them there. The tree was a sanctuary, not a tourist attraction. Chloe Hastings never returned to the foster system, nor did she ever speak to Rick again. Recognizing her unparalleled skills, the State Forestry Department offered her a special apprenticeship. She eventually moved into a small, sturdy cabin of her own making on a plot of land bordering the reserve, legally purchased with a grant organized by the town she had helped save. But every year, on the anniversary of the night she was thrown out, Chloe walks deep into the Whispering Giants tract. She slips through the veil of sword ferns, opens a hidden wooden door, and sits by a rusted wood stove. She sits in the silence of the hollow, listening to the wind high above, eternally grateful to the broken, scarred giant that taught her how to stand tall when the whole world tries to blow you down.